Hello there. You are listening to KPCA LP, Petaluma, California, 103.3 FM. You can find us online at kpca.fm and by email at kpca@pcatv or by snail mail at P.O. Box 2806, Petaluma 94953. So you are listening to State of the Union with DG the 30-something. I do want to start by talking a second about our upcoming fundraiser for PCA and KPCA Radio. So this is a great event where you get the opportunity. It's called the Envelope Please to dress up, drink champagne, and watch the Academy Awards on the big screen at the Mystic Theater. So you're seeing it on a real big screen. The event is Sunday, March 4th, 2018 at 5 p.m. And you can grab your tickets now for $40 pre-sale. And they are available at our physical location at 205 Keller Street or online at www.pca.tv. And if you'd like any more information, you can give us a call again on the phone number, which is 707-773-3190. Did want to take a moment to say happy Fat Tuesday and also happy Galentine's Day. If you're unfamiliar with Galentine's Day, it is where we get to celebrate the amazing women in our life on Valentine's Day Eve. So you can see I'm sporting my beads, and I'm actually going to take them off before I start because I don't want to make light of the topic today, which we are talking about policies that affect prisons, individuals, and the incarceration. And so there's going to be a good amount of data coming at you. So that is where I'm going to start. I'm going to derobe quickly. The beads are fun. Alrighty, so again, if you are watching this on the live Facebook page right now, you can ask questions. I always do my best to answer the questions while I'm on my show. So if you haven't watched before, you'll notice me looking down in order to catch those questions you might have. If I cannot answer it right at this moment, then I'll do my best to get in touch with you and try to share it later. So give me 1 second to make sure I have everything set up. We're always trying to make sure that you can hear me on the Facebook page. All right. So here we go. This can be a somewhat sensitive topic. Again, this is based on data and my opinion, not that of KPCA. And so I always want to remind people of that. And my goal on this show is to analyze policy as well as give information so that the listeners can then develop their own opinion around the matter. At the end, I always do my own analysis and my own interpretation of the data and policy. So you'll get that at the end of the show. I have a lot of notes. I think it's some of the most notes I've ever had for a show because there's so much information about this. And so today I'm really not going to be able to cover everything. I could probably teach an entire university class on this, but I am going to try to share some data that shows what the prisons and jails look like in the country. Mainly it's going to be prisons nationally, and then I do talk about jails in California, since that's where we're at. So I want to start by giving just some broad statistics about the prisoner population and things along that nature. And this is from Mike. I always try to cite my sources so that you know where I got it if you want to refer back. And I can always provide more specific information about those sources if you like it. So the U.S. is currently 5% of the world's population, but hold 25% of the world's prisoners. Incarceration has increased 500% in the last 20 years, and I think there's a funny parallel to that, or I don't know if it's ironic, funny. So I will point that out when we get to that area of the show. 1 in 20 Americans have a parent behind bars, and 3 of 4 black men in D.C. will spend time behind bars. Besides, and then again, I will get into this more in specific, besides the fact that all races show the same drug rates. because we'll learn later that drug offenses are one of the largest populations in our jails and prisons still. So I also wanted to give, so this is straight from the Federal Bureau of Prisons and their website. This is the data that's actually posted publicly on their website about who prisoners are. So 13% of prisoners are Black, and that is compared to a 13% overall national population. 58.4 are white, and the white people make up 72% of the total population. This is based, I got the population information from the census in order to make the comparison. 46, oh, I skipped one. So 2.2% of prisoners are Native American, and they are only 0.9 of the, I saw 0.2 to 0.9% of the population. So it varies. So 40, and you can start looking at the relativity of those percentages if you want. I didn't want to draw that out. 46.2% are incarcerated due to drug offenses, while an overwhelming amount are based on possession, not sales. And so, again, I'll get into my analysis of that later. The second highest was incarceration based on weapons, explosive, and arson, and that was only 17.4%. So you're talking about 46.2% is the highest with drug offenses, and weapons and arson, which we think of as crimes, they are crimes, of course, makes up 17.4%. 80% are U.S. citizens, and there's this blame that we've been seeing regularly that immigrants are criminals, and I don't need to quote that or say anything more about that. I think people are pretty clear. And so I did just want to pull out the statistics that only 13% of the prison population has Mexican citizenship, compared to 80% that are U.S. citizens, which would make sense. A large majority should be, or would likely be, U.S. citizens. So I'm a little out of order here. I went back and scribbled this all down and then had to go back and make some changes. Give me 1 second. And why isn't it showing me? I can't always see. Sometimes Facebook fights me on the situation. And for some reason, I'm going to go on a tangent, but for some reason, I keep turning off autoplay on Facebook on my iPad and it won't stop doing it. One of those little glitches. So I do want to talk about, and this name sometimes I have in the past in jobs I've worked at, it's called the Cradle Prison Pipeline. And the theory is that it is an attack on people of color and the poor. So I am going to give you statistics about children, and I think all this information is from the Defense Fund. So it gives some basic statistics, and I did it based on California. And then it talks about more about the prisoner incarceration population, as well as what's been in the news lately is about how children are being arrested in school and actually going through that process and then having to deal with the repercussions of that. And I actually worked in a community where children were, arrested. It depends on if they're in high school, but younger children were being taken out of classrooms by police officers. And, maybe it's better to wait to the end, but children are going to be children sometimes. So let's talk about California statistics about children in poverty. So I think most of this is from 2015. And so we'll start there. So in 2015, 73% of children in California were of color, which is a really interesting statistic because we've seen the demographics change over the last 30 to 50 years. So that is a little over 9 million children. And of that, 27% were white, 5% were African American, 52% were Hispanic, 11% were Asian, and then 6% other. So I'm assuming that is comprised of Native American and other ethnicities that aren't included here. or sometimes it could be mixed race if people don't report the same way. 1 in 4 were poor, with 1 in 11 children living in extreme poverty. I was a little, I won't say annoyed, but I don't like that they use the word poor because it's not a descriptor that we use. I'm going to make the assumption they're talking about poverty because they just talked about a statistic based on extreme poverty. So we'll go with living in 100% of the poverty level up to 200 is where we kind of see a lot of the services being provided over the years. So let's just go with that. So under 2% of the poverty level. And currently for an individual, if I remember offhand, it's $13,200 is your annual income to be considered in poverty. So in California, you can see how a child would be in poverty real fast because the poverty level is calculated based on national data and not specific to California. So again, I don't want to go on a tangent, but I did wish I made some notes about that. So if you've ever heard of a living wage, it has some other names by different organizations, but basically the living wage assesses based on county what a family would be required to make in order to live in that county. I think in Marin County, it's up to, for a parent, 2 parents and 2 kids. When I was working down there, I think it was 87,000, but now I want to say it's up to 102,000. I'll have to check back with some of my colleagues that work down there, but I do think it's around 102,000. So again, both parents would have to be working full time, making over $50,000 a year net. After taxes. So that means this is a broad number, but 2 people making about $70,000 a year. And so back to our conversation about the poor versus extreme poverty. So that gives a little bit of gauge. And a lot of service providers in California take issue with the fact that the poverty level is calculated based on the nation because we see huge variance in the country. So, and the Bay Area is one of the most expensive places to live in the country, if not the most. I think actually it is the most expensive place to live in the country. New York must be a close second, if not first. So, again, back to the stats. 73% of 4th grade students in 2013 couldn't read at grade level. That is a lot of kids that can't read at grade level. And bringing it back to the cradle to prison pipeline is the theory that if children are below average, and there's a lot of indications, it could have been they didn't have early childhood education, they didn't have as much parent involvement, which we see. And so there's a lot of contributors to that, but 73% of 4th grade students, that's a lot of kids. I don't have the number, but out of 9 million, I'm not really good at mental math on the spot, but out of 9 million, that is a lot of kids that are not reading at grade level. So, like I said, part of the theory is that if we keep students under grade level are not succeeding as well, that they then will go down a different path. And there are a lot of the theory has to do with, like I said, people of color and the poor, because they tend to live in poor counties or poor school districts, and so the schools have less money, and therefore there's pretty extreme outcome differences among students. I did create an entire graphic that compared Marin City to Ross. They are cities in Marin County that have a similar size. And it was very, very tangible, the difference in success in school and poverty level. And Ross is very wealthy, and Marin City has a lower median household income. So those stats are out there. I don't have those off the top anymore. I used to have them, but basically, this isn't being made up, that there is a connection between people of color and poor, and more people of color are poor or living in poverty. I'd rather use living in poverty. That's something we're most in public health. So with hashing that out more is that 73% of all 4th graders, but 87% of Black 4th graders and 84% of Hispanic 4th graders were reading, couldn't read at grade level. Pardon me. Again, there's a lot of contributing factors to that, but a lot of them are indicated by being poor in this country. And California, like I said, this isn't I don't want to say it's easy to be poor, but it is. You know, there's like it's really expensive to live here. I have a hard time living here, and I'm an individual person that works full time. So this is actually a really big one too. Is that educational outcomes are also based on suspension rates, and we see that children of color are suspended or expelled way more often, and that. Again, it's so interesting. So it's so hard to talk about this without getting ahead of myself because we talk about suspension, but then we also talk about students being arrested out of school as elementary, all the way down to elementary school students. And then we see the really high rates of incarceration for people of color. So all those things will come full circle because they're really, really important indicators of this cradle to prison pipeline. And this is the one that's pretty eye-catching, that California spent 5.1 times more on a prisoner than a public school student. Someone did mention, okay, it's way more expensive to house a prisoner, but 5 times more expensive than helping a public school student. I'm not really sure. So, that's a big thing to consider. And of course, and again, this will come back in my analysis, but in theory, if we had less incarcerated people, it would be less expensive. We could put less money into each individual prisoner, and then that money could go a whole other places. But this is a perfect segue into my next topic. If there was less people incarcerated, then the private prisons would get real upset. So a lot of people don't realize this. So there are for-profit prisons in our country. That means that they are not government agencies. They are allowed to draw a profit from being a prison. This is super interesting, and they're on the rise. I always like to say the government's getting out of trying to provide as much as possible, but it causes a lot of issues. So this information is based on the Corrections Corp of America. Because that's apparently the coalition of for-profit prisons. Of course, they have to band together so they can gang up. I don't know where, I thought I had the statistic here that I think they only make up a small percent, but I don't know why, I don't know where it is. So I thought it was like 6 to 9% of the total prisons, but again, that's on the rise, and there's huge issues with that. So they've seen a 500% increase in profit over the last 20 years. 500%. And that's profit, not revenue. As a note. Psychology studies showed that so we're jumping into, that was the stat based on the corp. Now I'm going to go back to some other information that I gathered. So, and I think some of this was included. A psychological study showed that private prisons drop costs while malnourishing inmates. And the study was based on inmates that lost 10 to 60 pounds while incarcerated. Unfortunately, the source that I got this from didn't cite the original source, or I didn't grab it. It probably was in the footnotes, and I just kind of was writing down so much that I jumped over it. I'm sure it's an actual psychological study. They do a lot of psychological studies in prisons, and again, I don't want to get into that whole tangent because I know a lot about those. And of course, we have this whole idea, or when we think about prisons, we think about people sitting there and making license plates, right? That was one of the traditional things. So, but actually, a lot of these private prisons are building military equipment by ultimately eliciting slave behavior, labor. And then, so speaking of government contracts, so the private prisons do have contracts with the government in order to receive prisoners and procure these contracts, but there's a 90% promise of occupancy given the government contracts that they're in. So I'll get back to that, but just think about that for a second. If they have to have a guaranteed of 90% occupancy, what does that mean? What do we all think that means? So crimes are down overall in the United States. However, they find a way to have 90% occupancy. And I wrote a note that says, enter the war on drugs. And again, I don't know where the statistic is about the offenses, but we'll come to it. Like I said, I wrote this all down and then I jumped back and forth, and so it'll come up at some point. But it was a significant portion. Oh wait, no, I did. Oh, I did do it. I think it was 46% of prisoners are there because of drug offenses, and most all are sales, not sales. They're from possession, not sales. So in theory, the war on drugs, and it's been shown to not work, but it's still harped on. And we're talking like statistics and data show it doesn't work. And it also doesn't serve as a deterrent, which was the original ploy, I guess, that it would deter people. The problem is that it jailed and imprisoned people for possession or multiple occurrences of possession or possession on parole. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, but it wasn't really targeting sales, distribution, and, making a profit off of selling drugs. Even in California, marijuana, cannabis has been decriminalized, but we still see that not most, but a significant proportion of those who are jailed are still there for drug offenses. I do know a little while ago they did run a program where they started releasing people that were, under good behavior to have their cases reheard and then go on to parole. So we are making changes here, but and again, there's documentaries about this. There's a lot of information about this. I know someone told me Jay-Z does a lot of work around this, and then Van Jones does his Yes We Code program. Is trying to give black men and black youth skills that are necessary so they don't fall into this cradle to prison pipeline. So the other important thing about this corporation or old boys club of prisons, I like to call it, is that it's like our government. So over 45 million has been sent on campaign donations and lobbyists. This is important. It's a private company. So it, perhaps in its contracts, like public companies do, they have to report who their lobbyists are, but they have a lot more leeway in persuading and spending a lot of money on campaign donations and lobbyists. So they obviously have a agenda, and I wouldn't be surprised if these private prisons keep increasing. Again, the government's kind of trying to turf off a lot of services to for-profit companies. Sometimes that's a good thing because they're more efficient, but sometimes it is a very bad thing. So the highest, I don't mean to be mean, but this wasn't shocking. So this is from, this is Pew data. The highest private prison populations are in Texas, Florida, Georgia, and Oklahoma. And these are countries that in certain areas experience extreme poverty among their populations, especially amongst their populations of color. So that is this is really important. Again, we live in California, but I never want people to automatically assume that is the answer for the rest of the country. Hold on, I'm going to look.
It depends on if they're in high school.
I swear I can't get this to stop auto-playing. Hi, Dottie. So getting back to, the highest private prison populations, Texas, Florida, Georgia, Oklahoma. And like I said, you see extreme poverty, and there is a lot of extreme poverty with people of color. And so again, we always want to get back to this cradle to prison pipeline. And again, I don't want to overuse that because I know it's like a trigger for people. But again, if you look at the data, there's a lot of indicators that lead toward that. And again, I'm not saying that I'm promoting that theory. I'm just providing it as a theory to look at if you are interested in these kind of things. It's a very well-known theory. And there's, like I said, there's a lot of data that speaks to it. And someone actually they recommended that I include this piece in here because they're talking about a documentary that Jay-Z did, and it was specifically about, he has a lot of work with the jails, prisons, and reentry, but he also did one with regard to bail bonds. So it's not shocking that poor people have a harder time paying bail in order to get out of jail or prison. So even if they have, I don't want to say minor, but even if they don't have major offenses, they can get stuck in jail for quite some time because they can't post bail. They don't have the resources, they don't have the down payment, they don't have the money, they don't have the family support. Again, there's a lot of indicators that could be contributing to why they cannot post bail. And I think that this is a really interesting fact because, again, it's showing how certain populations get stuck within the system. And, you know, if you work full-time or even part-time, if you have a family to support, and I heard someone, they got stuck in jail for a DUI for 3 weeks because they couldn't post bail. And I'm, you know, they missed, I think they missed their bench warrant, and so they actually got arrested. But that is as if a DUI isn't going to be hard enough on your record in your career. Taking away those weeks with your job, you're probably going to get fired by the time that you get back, and you have very limited communications and how many people want to call their boss and say, I'm sorry, I'm in jail. So this is a really interesting topic. I didn't do a whole lot of research on it because I had just so much other information, but I do think it's an interesting business to look into. Like, bail bondsmen are also for-profit companies, and I'm not going to say they do good work or bad work, but I do think that there are a lot of factors that contribute to the success of people that have to go through that process. Again, if you're not limited by finances, transportation, you can make it to court, even if you, then this is after if you post bail, and then you can still make it to court. These are really big things, and I'm pretty sure my next section talks about public defenders. I'm trying not to miss any information, because again, I did mix it up a little bit. Oh, here we go. Okay, so now we're getting into I numbered it wrong. How did I number it wrong? I'm really special sometimes. Okay, well, I'm just going to jump in here. I can't really remember where it came from. Oh, these are back to the Mike Daly statistics that I talked about in the beginning, but you should, it goes full circle, so it's all relevant data. So African Americans comprise 12% of drug users, which is consistent with the general population across all races, ethnicities. But 40% of those were arrested for drug offenses, so they're more likely to be arrested for a drug offense. 96% of convicts are based on convictions. Sorry, I don't like using the word convicts. 96% of convictions are based on a guilty plea rather than a trial by jury. So again, let me talk a second about juries, because while I think the more important part about this data is that these people are doing a guilty plea rather than going into trial, and juries are biased. They definitely are, because you have to start asking yourself, who can really sit on jury duty, and who doesn't get exempt from jury duty, and then what do those juries really look like? Because I guess if you're a government employee, you get paid to go to jury duty. A lot of other people don't, and then there's a lot of other circumstances that they don't have to sit on jury duty. Just like I own a company, so I don't have to sit on jury duty because it would be too much of a burden on my income and on my company for me to have to do jury duty. It's just one example. And again, it gets so much into this whole conversation about who's innocent, who isn't innocent, who's being convinced of one thing. Oh, what was the name of that series? Again, they've had a lot of examples and studies done showing how people can be convinced that they committed a crime that they didn't. And that is a huge idea. They use like psychologically challenging interrogation techniques. So again, I don't want to get entirely into that. There's certain cases where you see that, there's certain areas where you see that, but there is a lot of psychological research that shows that people are easily persuaded. And I'm totally going to blank on the name because I'm on the spot. But just for example, there was a psychological study done way back in the day. It's being considered now not ethical to repeat it, but it was really significant. If anyone knows that watching, I had someone just remind me what the name was the other day, but I can't remember it. But basically, the study involved a person that was being electrocuted in the chair in a room where the actual participant in the study was like behind a glass window looking at the person. And basically, there was a fake lab assistant pressuring the person into shocking the other person no matter what. And the doses went up, or the voltage went up all the way to a lethal amount. And it basically showed, and again, I don't have all the data offhand. If anyone does, it's a really popular study. So if anyone tuning in or wants to look that up for me real quick, it's a really popular study because it showed that people would do it. People would shock people to death if they were told to. And a lot of people went as far as to get right before a fatal voltage. So you're talking about permanent damage to the person. And so, again, the whole study was about the power of persuasion. And when you see someone as an authority figure, how you can be told what to do. And so it's not shocking that then, and there are studies specifically about interrogation techniques and torture. That's why torture is technically not legal, because the same thing happens. People, our brains start filling in information we can't completely remember, and then when someone's telling us to remember something different, our brains may actually do that. It may actually insert information, because daily there's certain things you're not going to remember. We all go through the day and say, I don't remember exactly what that conversation is or what exactly happened, and so we all go through that. And so you can just start to see how these things go. So I'm going to get back onto what I was talking about. Basically, to close that out, just for my own mental come around, is that, again, the statistic is 96% of convictions are based on a guilty plea and not on a trial, a jury, or like anything else, like a non-guilty plea, just getting sentenced based on that. So, between 2 and 5% of inmates, as far as we know now, are innocent. Again, there's a lot of studies going on that it might be larger, and it depends on the crime. And let's see. And so this gets back to, the lights are flickering in here. Is someone trying to tell me something? So 80% of defendants can't afford a lawyer. So this gets back to the conversation about bail bonds and people not being able to post bail, and then poor people not being able to defend themselves. So 80% is pretty significant, but lawyers are pretty significantly priced. I think in California, it's like anywhere from $3.50 an hour to $4.50 an hour plus, depending on how fancy the lawyer is. That's a lot of money. Someone could blow their annual income on, one case if it has to go too far. So tens of thousands go to jail without even speaking to an attorney. And I don't know why this is. Again, I feel like there's probably a lot of reasons. I know that there are people that are skeptical of attorneys and that they're worried that it's not in their best favor. But again, there's just so many things that could be going on. Maybe they didn't understand when they just got read the Miranda rights that they have the right to an attorney. Maybe they did that in process. Maybe they were never told that again. And so there's all those little things that, we may know, like, oh, yes, you can call an attorney. You can talk to an attorney. But you can't say that everyone knows that, especially if it's their first time in the system, or if they're a minor, or if they're just over 18, or even if it's multiple. If they never had done it before, why would they do it now? So speaking of public defenders, because you can have a public defender who does it, but on average they have a caseload of 100 at a time. So I am not by any means knocking public defenders. I know some of them, they work their back ends off. They're doing work where they get paid way less than a regular attorney. I think a couple years ago I saw a statistic, they start like $45,000 a year, and they went to law school, which is a lot of money. So 100 cases at a time. Could you imagine managing 100 projects at a time? And I had my first glimpse into a court system very intimately. I don't have a lot of legal experience, and thinking of an attorney managing 100 cases at a time is crazy. Like you literally, I imagine you're shuffling into court, like having to look through the case right at that moment, because unless you're working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and even if you were, that's like memorizing every single aspect. I do a lot of project management, so I like doing that parallel. It's like managing 100 projects and remembering every detail about that project off the top of your head. I could never do 100. That's insane. And so that's a big thing. So between, not speaking to an attorney and public defenders being super overloaded, it's hard to know which way that's going to go. And it's perhaps that is why 96% of convictions are based on a guilty plea, because they rather settle on some sort of punishment than have to go through this process and fight for their freedom. And again, getting back to the cradle to prison pipeline, unfortunately, and I've worked with kids of color, unfortunately, a lot of them just believe they're going to get arrested. And that's kind of what they grew up believing. I remember in a teen program that I started and worked with, I spoke with some of the teachers in the program, and they were talking about how they literally have to teach, especially the black boys, how to respond to police officers in order to not have an issue. There's a lot of, I can think right off the top of more than one false identity situation that happened there. It was a small community where you're talking about a 15-year-old. He was a big 15-year-old. He was a football player. He's a very great football player. He's got a scholarship to college. But the cops basically jumped him. And then after they searched him and took his information, they said, "Oh, I'm sorry, it's a mistaken identity." And he went along his way, and, that was that. Of course, he told people he's only 15 years old. But, what do you do in that situation? Because technically they didn't do anything illegal. It's not right, but it wasn't illegal. And again, that 15-year-old for the rest of his life is going to have to look behind his back. So a lot of these people, I would assume a significant amount of the people of color, and again, I don't know the data. I don't even know if there is qualitative data like this. Be really interesting. Just unfortunately have this really internal expectation that they're going to end up in jail at one point. Like the DC statistics, 3 of 4 black men in DC will spend time. So if you're a black man in DC, are you supposed to believe that you can not go to jail? And this doesn't mean that 3 and 4 black men in DC are criminals or have committed a crime or aren't on a successful path. It doesn't mean any of those things. So the statistics, I think, speak for themselves. And so going back to this, I just want to make sure that I want to go, okay, we're getting to where I like to give kind of my overall analysis. Again, I was just reminded to remind you that these are not the opinions of KPCA or PCA. These are mine. So let's get into it. So as we've seen, and as the data shows, people of color are incarcerated way more often. So this is from the NAACP, 5 times more black people are incarcerated versus white people in this country. And again, their population is, off the top, I remember it's between 12 and 14%. Currently, nationally. Poor people are incarcerated way more often as well. So, again, bringing back to, I kind of belabored this before, so I'm not sure I need to mention again, but there is lack of access to lawyers, and poor people cannot meet bail if they are in jail. And basically, from this, and I'm going to just be brash about it, wealthy white people can fight their way out by paying attorneys, and you can see where there's a lot of inherent bias that is created. Some of it's not even inherent bias. Some is like blatant racism and blatant bias, but you can start to see based on the incarceration differences between the black and white. Again, black people are incarcerated 5 times more than white people, and if it's the same set of crimes. So you can start to see where this bias is created. A judge is supposed to be objective and non-biased, but if they have an inherent bias, which is, in short, it's a very deep down conditioned response that many of us are actually unaware of because we haven't looked at it. And then there's just blatant racism. So if a person of color is in front of them and they say, oh, well, they are filling our jails and they're all the criminals, and we're being told that, his Mexicans are all criminals and all this kind of stuff in the major media, people are going to start to develop biases. So again, an example of an inherent bias, I don't have the data about it. Well, I do, because it's 5 times more black people. But an inherent bias would be if a judge saw a black man, for example, let's use that one because they're incarcerated the most. If a black man is in front of them, they're going to have this automatic response that they are more likely to be a criminal. They're more likely to be a drug addict. They're more likely to be poor. They're more likely to have a history, all those kind of things. Those are inherent biases because the judge may not even realize it's occurring. So it's been conditioned, especially if the judge has been working in a certain area for so long. Again, it's in an area where there's the highest private prison populations, Texas, Florida, Georgia, Oklahoma. And they see the same, they have this inherent bias that because of the color of their skin, and sometimes because of the crime, that inevitably they're guilty. So, and again, I'm not saying that that's a regular thing. It's just a suggestion that it might be occurring. We know in psychology that we all have inherent biases. Every single one of us do. And one of the key things is being able to recognize them. And then, of course, if you're racist, you're racist. Not a whole lot to say about that. So back to this. So again, wealthy white people can fight. And I had to give this example. I honestly don't really know that there's going to be too many people that will argue this issue, but I know there are. But Brock Turner is a perfect example, and this is relatively current, so I wanted to bring it up. But Brock Turner got 6 months of containment for rape, and the average sentence is 3 to 5 years. And again, there's a bunch of other contributing factors that relate to the sentencing period, but I'm just gonna say that. And again, I know a lot of people know this, and a lot of people know why this occurred. But 6 months of containment versus 3 to 5 years is, again, I'm just gonna leave that there. And we had witnesses. There was all sorts of stuff that happened in that case. And it was a relatively short case. If people didn't notice, sometimes these cases can go on for a very long time. And Stanford did kick him out. So that was something that happened after this. So I am almost out of time. I usually give myself about a half an hour for commentary, but I don't have a whole lot of time. So I'm just going to get a few solutions. And they're, short of scrapping the entire judicial system, which is probably necessary at this point and starting over, there are solutions that are happening. So the most obvious, I'm going to say, is addressing inequality and racism. And further, I do think that this conversation about inherent bias has to be expanded. And people have to realize that we all have it, and it's really down there, and you really have to start listening to your thoughts in order to see it. And again, it's not abnormal to have this, so people shouldn't feel bad addressing it, but it is. I've been in rooms where this is the conversation and people get really defensive because the whole thing is, I'm not racist. No one's calling you racist, but you do have to check your bias. This has been a big conversation lately. And then, of course, we have a lot of racism in this country that is disguised by many other issues. And so, it's like, let's address inequality and racism. It's a very pie in the sky. I feel like I'm Miss America contestant, which I never would be, but I feel like a Miss American, like, we want world peace. Like, oh, we want inequality and racism. Okay. So yes, very pie in the sky. Of course, we all want to work towards that. Breaking the the cradle to prison pipeline. This one, again, has so many contributing factors. This is very pie in the sky, but I do think the first step is hearing this data and realizing there's a problem. People talk about this being a problem all the time. But what can be done to shift this? It hasn't changed. Like, this data hasn't changed for a long time. And again, there's this theory that basically slavery never ended. That instead of being slaves, there's a lot of movement towards incarceration of people of color. Again, so many contributing factors. The Native American populations, they have a high relative rate of incarceration. They were basically stripped of everything they had, including their identity, their land. A lot of the tribes, especially in Northern California, were separated into government-designated areas that may not have been where they lived or knew how to live or how they flourished. And again, they were all separate. It's the whole separate and conquer mentality as far as I'm concerned. So in those communities, you see very high levels of drug use. So very high levels of incarceration with notes for very high alcoholism and methamphetamine use. So there's so many contributing factors. We have to start reentry programs. This is one of the hardest things to get funded. And a reentry program, if you're not aware, is programming that once people are out of jail or prison, we provide programming to re-enter them into society, which might mean drug and alcohol treatment, education, adult education, counseling, medical care, direct medical care, psychiatric care, all those kind of things. And I always call them wraparound programs because you take the person, you wrap around all the services around them. But this whole idea of reentry services is remarkably foreign. There are some great examples around the nation. There's great examples in California, but we really need to focus. That's one of the main ways we're going to break the cycle, is providing people with the services once they leave to not just get back in the cycle. Don't drop them on the street when they had a methamphetamine possession, conviction, and they're in jail for a short amount of time and they're dropped back on the street with no money and no belongings. And again, we do need to address the education system in this country. I think I've mentioned it a lot of times. I actually don't think I've done an education-specific show, but I talk about education for a long time. Our education system has been completely broken down. I talk a lot about it when I talk about media literacy, too. This idea of cultural competency, this is, again, a very pie-in-the-sky idea, but before we need to really focus on cultural competency amongst individuals, I think we start with our agencies, and even our agencies that claim to provide these services. You'd be shocked how, drug and alcohol programs and clinics, they don't even know how to deal with or work with the populations that they're serving in a culturally competent manner. And again, I think it comes back to, well, who's serving the African-American population? Who's serving the Native American populations? Are they natives that understand the culture of that tribe? And there's a lot of different tribes with different, cultural activities. Or is it someone that studied that and claims they know it? Or, there's all those outliers. And then even African-American people, unfortunately, people say, oh, you're African-American, you're all the same. And you can't look at any one person and say your treatment's going to be the same as some other person. It might by coincidence be the same as someone you've worked with before, or you might be able to apply what you did with someone else to some extent, but it all needs to be adapted. And the federal government funds a lot of evidence-based programs. And the problem with them is that through the evaluation measures, there isn't always room for making it culturally competent to the individual culture. So it might have been developed for the Mexican-American or Hispanic populations, but then they want you to apply it in an African-American community. There are some parallels, but it's not the same. And so I think I've said this before, but I work for a tribe, and I see the same thing in a lot of the contract proposals, is that they want you to implement in the tribal community a program that showed promise in an African-American community. Again, there's similarities, but there has to be adaptation. And there isn't a lot of research with regard to the native populations when it comes to a whole myriad of issues. So again, I don't want to go on a tangent. So again, with everything I've talked about, we need a cultural change. We need the news. Like, again, I'm not going to go on a tangent. I don't want to go back on that tangent, but the news really dramatizes the coverage. It is, I'm just going to say the coverage is racist. It's biased, and it's not showing a true picture of who people that are convicted are in this country. It's claiming a lot of data that's not true. And so that's a big reason to do community radio. And we're looking for new shows. If you want to come on, is to the reason I'm here is to do my very best to provide data so that people can have the data and then form their own opinion. And then, of course, I share my analysis, and you do get a little peek at my opinion. But again, I'm not trying to persuade people to believe one thing or the other. I know I can't change your mind. We have different expertise. We have different levels of knowledge and data that's in our head or not there. So anyway, I just want to make that very clear. This show is probably one of the more polarized ones, meaning people are either way over here or they're way over there. My show on DACA in Charleston was probably pretty close because there is really this fight on both sides of the spectrum. And I think both of those sides need to be heard. But again, the data speaks for itself here. So again, I do this all the time. I have it written down later, but judges are an important factor in this process. Again, they are supposed to be providing a non-biased interpretation of the law in that jurisdiction, whether it's county, state, or federal. And that law, I did do a whole, racism in policy, or how ethnicity focuses policy. So I'm not going to say that all the laws are fair or just, but the judges are supposed to they're trained to interpret the law and give convictions based on the judgment schedule that they're provided. They ultimately can, and it's different in states and areas and rules, but it's their job to make a fair decision. I'm pretty sure that's part of the oath, isn't it? To be fair and equal and to provide accurate interpretations to law as far as you can, and to not have personal interest in the case. Otherwise you can't sit on the jury if you have a personal interest in the case or a whole other list of reasons. So we need a fair justice system. And again, in my mind, it doesn't seem like a pie in the sky idea, but it is, because it's really going to require a complete dismantling of the justice system all the way from the top down, or bottom up. Maybe we can do it that way, since some states have taken a stand on doing reform locally. But again, it still gets tricky when you get into federal law and you're in federal court, because it has to be based on those laws. And again, there's so many. I'm not an attorney, so there's way more details and overlapping details about that. So I don't want to get too much in the weeds about that, because I'm not an expert whatsoever. So in the end, because I'm running out of time. I know now next time this is way too much information, but I hope that if you caught part of it live, or even if you caught the whole thing live, when you do have time to play it back, this video is on this page and it will live on this page. So you can go back and watch it again. I always like to say it's good background noise. If you're doing something where you can think at the same time, it's definitely not a music show that you want just in the background while you're reading a novel, unless you're really good at multitasking. So I am about to sign off. You will see me again. So I'm on the first Tuesday of every month at 7 p.m. for right now. And so you can catch me again on 103.3 if you're in the Petaluma area, kpca.fm, or right here live on the Facebook page. And I do want to get more people engaged with asking questions. I know a lot of these topics are a lot of information, and perhaps people want to think about it before they ask a question, which is totally fine. And so just make sure to shoot those over later, whether you private message me or you comment on the post or you email me, however you want to find me, you can find me. And that would be great. So I am signing off, and KPCA is signing off until Thursday. So you can catch us back on air then. And again, to go around, you are watching KPCA LP, Petaluma, California, 103.3 FM. You can catch us online at kpca.fm. The email is kpca@pca.tv, and the mailing address is P.O. Box 2806, Petaluma 94953. Enjoy your Fat Tuesday.